What if I told you that the man who spent months claiming he was desperately searching for two missing children had been lying all along? What if I told you that he recently confessed to covering up what really happened? And what if I told you that his confession might finally reveal the truth about where 6-year-old Lily and 4-year-old Jack Sullivan really are? This is the story of Daniel Martell, the man who became the face of a frantic search for two missing children. For months, he appeared on television, joined search parties, and told anyone who would listen that he would search for the rest of his life if he had to. But recently leaked messages reveal a very different truth. Messages where Daniel admits he knew the children never went into the woods. Messages where he confesses to deliberately misleading everyone. Messages that might finally explain what happened to Jack and Lily Sullivan. If you're new here and stories like this matter to you, hit that subscribe button now. Because the truth in this case has been buried under months of lies, and we're about to uncover it all. It began as a simple story of tragedy. On a quiet morning, two young children vanished from their home. Their mother, Malaya, and her boyfriend Daniel claimed they had no idea what happened. The children, they said, had simply disappeared. Search parties combed through endless miles of forest. Volunteers gave up their weekends. The community rallied around what they believed was every parent's worst nightmare. But Daniel Martell wasn't just any boyfriend. He had been living with Malaya and her children, acting as a father figure to Jack and Lily. He was one of the last people to see them alive. And from the very beginning, something about his behavior didn't sit right with those who knew him best. While Malaya retreated from public view, consumed by what appeared to be overwhelming grief, Daniel stepped forward. He became the spokesperson for the search efforts. He gave interviews. He made emotional pleas. He promised he would never stop looking. To the outside world, he seemed like a man driven by love and determination. But to those closest to the case, his behavior raised more questions than answers. The first red flag came from the children's grandmother, Belinda. She reached out to Daniel multiple times, desperate for answers, desperate for any information that might help find her grandchildren. She sent message after message, each one more emotional than the last. She begged him to talk to her, to share anything that might help. But Daniel never responded. Not once. He read her messages, but he never replied. For a grandmother watching her family fall apart, Daniel's silence felt like cruelty. Here was a man claiming to love her grandchildren, claiming he would search forever, but he couldn't even respond to their grandmother's desperate pleas for communication. It was the first sign that something was deeply wrong. The second red flag came from his own words. In interviews, Daniel often spoke about what he had done, how he was coping, how difficult this was for him. But he spoke very little about Jack and Lily themselves. For someone who claimed to love these children like his own, his focus seemed strangely self-centered. Viewers began to notice that he talked more about his own experience than about the missing children. Then came the inconsistencies in his story. Details that changed slightly with each telling. Timelines that didn't quite line up. Small contradictions that, on their own, might have been explained by trauma or confusion. But taken together, they painted a picture of someone who was not being completely truthful. The breaking point came when Daniel made a chilling statement during one of his television appearances. Looking directly into the camera, he said, "If I have to, I'll search for the rest of my life." On the surface, it sounded like the words of a devoted father figure. But to many who heard it, something about that statement felt wrong. It sounded less like hope and more like resignation. As if he already knew that the children would never be found alive. But what no one knew at the time was that Daniel was carrying a secret. A secret that would eventually tear apart everything he had built. A secret that would reveal the truth about what really happened to Jack and Lily Sullivan. That secret remained buried for months. Until recently, when Daniel's own words betrayed him. In a series of leaked messages, Daniel finally admitted what many had suspected all along. He had been lying. He had been covering up. And he had been protecting someone. The question that haunts this case isn't just what happened to Jack and Lily. It's how many people knew the truth and chose to stay silent. It's about the power of love to make people do terrible things. And it's about the moment when protecting someone you care about becomes more important than protecting innocent children. As we dive deeper into this case, we'll explore every twist, every contradiction, and every moment that brought us to this shocking revelation. We'll examine the evidence, analyze the behavior, and try to understand how a man who claimed to love 2 children could spend months lying about what happened to them. But before we continue, I need you to understand something. This isn't just a story about missing children. This is a story about the lies we tell ourselves, the people we choose to protect, and the price we pay for silence. It's about the moment when love becomes complicity, and when the desire to protect someone we care about leads us to betray innocent children. The truth about Jack and Lily Sullivan is still emerging. But Daniel's confession has opened a door that can never be closed. And what lies behind that door might be more disturbing than anyone imagined. To understand Daniel Martell's confession, we first need to understand who Daniel really was. Because the man who appeared on television, making emotional pleas for 2 missing children, was not the same man who was living behind closed doors with Jack, Lily, and their mother. Daniel wasn't the children's biological father, but he had been living with them and Malaya for months. To the outside world, he appeared to be a devoted father figure. He talked about cooking their meals, helping with homework, tucking them in at night. He painted a picture of a man who had stepped up to care for 2 children who needed him. But even his own description of his role in the children's lives raised questions. Daniel claimed that Jack and Lily loved him more than they loved their own mother. He insisted that he was the one they ran to when they were scared, the one they trusted, the one who truly cared for them. These weren't the words of a humble stepfather. These were the words of someone who seemed to be competing with their mother for their affection. If these dynamics were true, they painted a troubling picture of the household. A picture of a man who saw himself as the children's savior and a mother who was somehow failing them. It suggested a level of dysfunction that went far beyond what anyone had imagined. Daniel's behavior after the children disappeared only deepened these concerns. While Malaya retreated from public view, Daniel embraced it. He gave interviews, appeared on live streams, and made public statements. But his demeanor during these appearances struck many as odd. He often seemed more concerned with defending himself than with finding the children. In one particularly disturbing moment, Daniel was filmed making a birthday video for Lily while she was still missing. What should have been a heartbreaking moment of hope became something else entirely when viewers noticed what they described as a smirk on Daniel's face. It was a fleeting expression, but it was enough to make people question whether his grief was genuine. The more Daniel spoke publicly, the more questions arose about his mental state and his ability to handle the situation. Several people who interacted with him described his behavior as awkward and childlike. They noted his difficulty maintaining eye contact, his tendency to smile at inappropriate moments, and his overall emotional flatness. Some observers wondered if Daniel might be neurodivergent, struggling with social cues and emotional expression in ways that made him appear suspicious when he was simply overwhelmed. His YouTube channel, which focused on Pokemon content, reinforced the image of someone who might be emotionally underdeveloped or stuck in a younger mental state. But being awkward or socially challenged doesn't explain everything. It doesn't explain why Daniel refused to communicate with the children's family. It doesn't explain the inconsistencies in his story. And it doesn't explain why he seemed more focused on his own image than on finding Jack and Lily. The pattern of Daniel's behavior suggested someone who was not just struggling with the situation, but actively trying to control it. He was selective about who he spoke with, careful about what he revealed, and defensive when pressed for details. This wasn't the behavior of someone who was simply overwhelmed. This was the behavior of someone who was protecting something. One of the most troubling aspects of Daniel's public persona was his apparent acceptance that the children might never be found alive. While most people in his situation would cling to hope, Daniel seemed to have already moved into a state of resignation. His statement about searching for the rest of his life, if he had to, sounded less like determination and more like someone who had already accepted a terrible outcome. This resignation became even more disturbing when viewed alongside his other behaviors. Here was a man who claimed to love these children like his own, but who seemed to have given up hope of finding them alive. It raised the question of whether Daniel knew something about their fate that he wasn't sharing. The contrast between Daniel's public persona and his private behavior became even more stark when we consider his relationship with the children's extended family. While he was willing to speak to strangers, to give interviews to news outlets, and to make public statements, he refused to communicate with the people who loved Jack and Lily most. Belinda, the children's grandmother, made repeated attempts to reach out to Daniel. She sent him messages, asked for information, begged him to share anything that might help find her grandchildren. But Daniel never responded. He read her messages, but he never replied. For a grandmother desperate for answers, this silence felt like betrayal. The question that haunted everyone who knew about Daniel's refusal to communicate was simple. If he truly wanted to help find the children, why wouldn't he talk to their family? If he truly had nothing to hide, why would he avoid the people who were most invested in finding answers? Daniel's behavior created a pattern that was impossible to ignore. He was willing to speak publicly, but not privately. He was willing to give interviews to strangers, but not to answer questions from family members. He was willing to make grand statements about his love for the children, but not to engage in the difficult conversations that might actually help find them. This pattern suggested someone who was more interested in controlling the narrative than in finding the truth. Someone who was more concerned with managing his public image than with actually helping the investigation. Someone who was playing a role rather than living through a genuine crisis. As we'll see in the next part of the story, the morning that Jack and Lily disappeared was filled with inconsistencies and contradictions that would later prove to be the foundation of Daniel's deception. But even before we examine that timeline, Daniel's behavior in the aftermath of their disappearance had already revealed the truth about who he really was. He wasn't the devoted father figure he claimed to be. He wasn't the heartbroken man desperately searching for two children he loved. He was someone with something to hide, someone who was willing to lie to protect himself and others, and someone who was more concerned with his own survival than with the lives of two innocent children. The mask Daniel wore for the public was convincing for a while. But masks always slip eventually. And when Daniel's mask finally fell away, it revealed something far more disturbing than anyone had imagined. The morning of Jack and Lily's disappearance began like any other, but it would end with a phone call that changed everything. At 6:18 a.m., while most people were still sleeping, Malaya made a call to the children's school. She was calling in their absence, reporting that Jack and Lily would not be attending school that day. This single phone call would later become one of the most crucial pieces of evidence in the case. Because according to Daniel, he had no idea the children were going to stay home that day. He claimed he only discovered this information later when he checked the call logs on Malaya's phone. But this claim would prove to be just the first of many lies he would tell about that morning. The significance of this 6:18 a.m. call cannot be overstated. It meant that before most people were even awake, before Daniel claimed to know anything was wrong, Malaya had already made the decision to keep the children home from school. The question that haunted investigators was simple. Why? If the children had simply wandered off or been abducted, why would Malaya have called the school hours before anyone noticed they were missing? The only logical explanation was that she knew they wouldn't be going to school that day. And if she knew that, it meant their disappearance was planned. But Daniel's story about discovering this information later raised even more questions. If he truly found out about the call by checking phone records, why didn't he immediately report this to police? Why didn't he question Malaya about why she had called the school? Why did he present this information as if it were routine rather than deeply suspicious? The answer, as we now know from Daniel's own confession, is that he was lying. He knew about the call. He knew the children weren't going to school. And he knew that their disappearance was not the random tragedy he was pretending it was. The timeline of that morning, as presented by Daniel and Malaya, was filled with inconsistencies that should have raised immediate red flags. They claimed that neither of them noticed the children were missing until 9:40 a.m. This was supposedly the moment when they realized something was wrong and began to panic. But 9:40 a.m. is an unusually late time for parents to notice that their children are missing. With Jack and Lily being only 4 and 6 years old, and with a toddler also in the house, it's almost impossible to believe that two adults could go nearly 4 hours without seeing or hearing from any of the children. In households with young children, silence is usually the first sign that something is wrong. Children that age are naturally noisy, constantly moving, asking for things, making their presence known. The idea that both parents could remain oblivious to their absence until nearly 10 a.m. defies belief. But the timeline problems didn't end there. Daniel's own behavior during those early hours was deeply suspicious. Rather than immediately calling police or organizing a search, he claimed to have spent time looking for clues, examining evidence, and trying to piece together what had happened. One of the pieces of evidence Daniel presented was a torn piece of blanket that he claimed to have found in the trash. He said it appeared to have been dragged out by an animal, possibly a bear. Later, he claimed that Malaya's family reported finding the same piece of blanket high up in a tree, which he found suspicious because the family hadn't been involved in searching that area. This story about the blanket would later prove to be another lie. But at the time, Daniel presented it as if he were being helpful, as if he were trying to assist the investigation. In reality, he was creating false evidence and spinning elaborate stories to cover up what really happened. The most damning aspect of Daniel's behavior that morning was his decision to actively mislead the search efforts. When police and volunteers began looking for the children, Daniel told them that Jack and Lily had gone into the woods. He claimed this was where they should focus their search efforts. He even joined search parties, spending hours combing through forested areas. But Daniel knew this was a lie. He knew the children had not gone into the woods. He knew the search parties were wasting their time. And he knew that every hour spent searching in the wrong direction was an hour that could have been used to find Jack and Lily if they were still alive. This deception wasn't just a lie. It was an active obstruction of justice. It was a deliberate attempt to derail the investigation and protect whoever was responsible for the children's disappearance. And it was a betrayal of every person who volunteered their time to search for two missing children. Years later, when confronted about his lies, Daniel would admit the truth. He told Darren, a family member, that he had deliberately misled everyone about the children going into the woods. When asked why he would do such a thing, Daniel's response was both heartbreaking and infuriating. "I still love Malaya, and I was trying to cover for her lie." This confession reveals the true nature of Daniel's behavior that morning. He wasn't confused or overwhelmed. He wasn't making mistakes due to trauma or stress. He was deliberately and systematically lying to protect Malaya, even though it meant betraying Jack and Lily. The morning of their disappearance wasn't a tragedy that happened to Daniel and Malaya. It was a crisis that they created, managed, and covered up together. The 6:18 a.m. phone call was the first move in a carefully orchestrated plan. The false timeline was designed to create confusion and buy time. And the misdirection about the woods was meant to send searchers in the wrong direction while evidence was disposed of or children were moved. But perhaps the most chilling aspect of that morning was the complete absence of genuine panic or urgency from either parent. There are no reports of frantic searching, desperate phone calls to neighbors, or immediate contact with police. Instead, there's a strange calm, a carefully controlled response that suggests people who are following a plan rather than reacting to a crisis. The truth about that morning would remain hidden for months. But the evidence was always there, waiting to be uncovered. The suspicious phone call, the implausible timeline, the deliberate misdirection of search efforts, all of it pointed to a cover-up from the very beginning. Daniel's confession about lying to protect Malaya was just the first crack in a wall of deception that had been built that morning. As that wall began to crumble, it would reveal not just the lies they had told, but the terrible truth about what really happened to Jack and Lily Sullivan. Sometimes the most damning evidence isn't what someone says, it's what they choose not to say. And in the case of Jack and Lily Sullivan, Daniel Martell's silence spoke louder than any words ever could. After the children disappeared, their grandmother Belinda found herself in an impossible situation. Her grandchildren were missing, her daughter was consumed by grief, and the man who claimed to love those children like his own refused to speak to her. Not just once, but repeatedly. Day after day, message after message, Belinda reached out to Daniel, desperate for any information that might help find Jack and Lily. But Daniel's response was always the same: silence. Belinda wasn't asking for much. She wasn't demanding confessions or accusations. She was simply asking for communication, for any detail that might help, for the basic human decency of acknowledging her pain. She was a grandmother watching her family fall apart, and she was begging the one person who might have answers to simply talk to her. But Daniel read her messages and never replied. Not once. He saw her desperation, her pain, her love for her grandchildren, and he chose to ignore it completely. For those who don't have children or grandchildren, it might be difficult to understand the depth of cruelty in Daniel's silence. But imagine being in Belinda's position. Imagine your grandchildren vanishing, and the last person to see them alive refusing to even acknowledge your existence. Imagine sending message after message, each one more desperate than the last, and being met with nothing but silence. This wasn't just absence of communication. This was active rejection. Daniel wasn't too overwhelmed to respond, too busy searching, or too traumatized to engage. He was making a conscious choice to ignore a grieving grandmother. He was choosing to let her suffer in isolation while he controlled the narrative through public statements and media appearances. The contrast between Daniel's public persona and his private behavior couldn't have been more stark. While he was willing to give interviews to strangers, make statements to news outlets, and appear on live streams, he refused to have a simple conversation with the children's own grandmother. He would talk to anyone except the people who loved Jack and Lily most. This pattern of behavior revealed something crucial about Daniel's state of mind. He wasn't acting like someone who was genuinely trying to help find the children. He was acting like someone who was managing a crisis, controlling information, and protecting himself from scrutiny. Someone who truly wanted to help would have welcomed any opportunity to share information, to collaborate with family members, to brainstorm possibilities. Someone who truly loved those children would have found comfort in talking to others who shared that love. Someone who truly had nothing to hide would have been eager to demonstrate their innocence through open communication. But Daniel chose isolation. He chose to maintain distance from the very people who should have been his allies in finding Jack and Lily. And in doing so, he revealed that his priorities were not about finding the children, but about protecting himself. The impact of Daniel's silence on Belinda was devastating. She interpreted his lack of response not as neutrality, but as cruelty. She saw it as a deliberate distancing, a conscious choice to abandon her in her darkest hour. For a grandmother desperate for answers, desperate for hope, desperate for any sign that someone else cared as much as she did, Daniel's silence felt like betrayal. But Daniel's avoidance extended beyond just ignoring messages. He actively avoided any face-to-face communication with Belinda or other family members. He steered clear of situations where he might be cornered, where he might be asked direct questions, where he might be forced to provide real answers. When asked why he wouldn't just talk to the family, Daniel gave no satisfying explanation. He didn't claim to be too emotional, too busy, or too overwhelmed. He simply avoided the question, just as he avoided the family. This avoidance was a choice, and it was a choice that spoke volumes about his true state of mind. The cruel irony of Daniel's behavior was that while he was maintaining this wall of silence with a family, he was simultaneously presenting himself to the public as someone who cared deeply about the children. He was giving interviews about his love for Jack and Lily, his commitment to finding them, his willingness to search forever. But he wouldn't even acknowledge the existence of their grandmother. This contradiction revealed the performative nature of Daniel's public grief. He wasn't expressing genuine emotion or authentic concern. He was playing a role, maintaining an image, and controlling a narrative. And that role didn't include actually helping the people who were most invested in finding the children. The silence also served a strategic purpose. Every conversation Daniel avoided was a conversation where he might have revealed something damaging. Every question he didn't answer was a question that couldn't expose his lies. Every relationship he didn't maintain was a relationship that couldn't hold him accountable. By maintaining his silence with the family while speaking publicly, Daniel was able to control the flow of information. He could present his version of events without being challenged by people who knew the truth. He could maintain his innocent facade without having to face the scrutiny of those who loved Jack and Lily most. But silence, especially in a case involving missing children, is never neutral. It's always a choice. And in Daniel's case, it was a choice that revealed his true priorities. He was more interested in protecting himself than in finding the children. He was more concerned with managing his image than with helping the investigation. He was more committed to maintaining his lies than to honoring his claimed love for Jack and Lily. The weight of Daniel's silence became even heavier when we consider what it cost. Every day that passed without communication was a day that potential leads went unexplored. Every question that went unanswered was a question that might have helped find the children. Every relationship that was abandoned was a relationship that might have provided crucial support to the investigation. But perhaps most tragically, Daniel's silence robbed Belinda of the one thing she needed most, the feeling that someone else cared about her grandchildren as much as she did. In her darkest hours, when she needed to believe that others were fighting for Jack and Lily, Daniel's silence told her that she was alone. This wasn't just cruelty. It was a form of psychological torture. And it was a choice that Daniel made every single day, with every message he ignored, with every opportunity for communication he avoided. The silence that surrounded Daniel's behavior would eventually be broken by his own words. But by then, the damage had been done. The family had been isolated, the investigation had been compromised, and 2 children had been failed by the very person who claimed to love them most. As we'll see in the next part of this story, Daniel's silence would eventually give way to an explosion of words. But when he finally chose to speak, what he revealed would be even more damaging than his silence had been. For months, Daniel Martell had maintained his silence with the family while carefully managing his public image. But on one night, everything changed. What happened in a live stream chat would shatter the carefully constructed facade he had built and reveal the truth he had been hiding. It started innocuously enough. A live stream was in progress, focused on discussing the case of Jack and Lily Sullivan. The hosts were going through the usual topics, the search efforts, the timeline, the lack of progress. Just another evening of people trying to make sense of an impossible situation. But then, unexpectedly, a familiar username appeared in the chat. It was an account that matched Daniel's old YouTube channel from 2012, the one known for posting Pokemon content. The hosts verified it. It was really him. And what followed was unlike anything Daniel had ever shared publicly before. This wasn't the careful, measured Daniel from the television interviews. This wasn't the vague, evasive Daniel from the public statements. This was a man who seemed to have reached a breaking point, and the words that poured out of him would change everything. Daniel's tone was different, angry, desperate, urgent. The careful control he had maintained for months was gone, replaced by raw emotion and stunning revelations. He wasn't there to manage his image or control the narrative. He was there because he was afraid, and that fear had driven him to break his silence in the most public way possible. At the center of Daniel's outburst was Meadow, his biological daughter with Malaya. According to Daniel, Malaya had violated CPS protocols by taking Meadow without the required 24/7 supervision. She wasn't just avoiding reporters or skipping court appearances. She was actively fleeing from the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, and she had their daughter with her. This revelation reframed everything. Daniel wasn't just dealing with the disappearance of Jack and Lily anymore. He was dealing with the potential loss of his own daughter. And that threat had pushed him to a place where maintaining his silence was no longer possible. Daniel claimed that Malaya was spiraling, that she was mentally unstable and emotionally volatile. He said she had threatened to kill herself if authorities tried to take Meadow from her. This wasn't just about hiding from accountability anymore, this was about immediate danger to their daughter. But Daniel's revelations went far beyond just Malaya's current mental state. He began pulling back the curtain on what he called the control system around her, particularly focusing on her mother, Cindy. He accused Cindy of pulling the strings, controlling Malaya's movements, silencing her, and keeping her isolated. The accusations became even more specific and disturbing. Daniel claimed that Cindy was not just shielding Malaya from scrutiny, but was actively involved in covering things up. He went so far as to say that the family had found Jack and Lily and were hiding them, and that they had even stolen 2 of his sweaters to plant evidence against him. These weren't vague suspicions or emotional outbursts. These were specific, detailed accusations that painted a picture of a family conspiracy designed to frame Daniel while protecting Malaya. If true, They suggested a level of manipulation and deception that went far beyond anything anyone had imagined. But Daniel's harshest words weren't for Cindy. They were for Malaya herself. He revealed that she had cut all contact with him, that she had blocked him, refused to speak to him, and had even hung up the phone when she heard his voice. For a man who claimed to still love her, this rejection was clearly devastating. Daniel described a disturbing contradiction in Malaya's behavior. He said she had told RCMP officers that she felt safest when she was with him, but then left just 5 minutes later. According to Daniel, this contradiction was intentional, not fear, not grief, but a calculated cover-up. The reason for her sudden departure, Daniel claimed, was that she couldn't stay around him because she would crack and he would find out what really happened. This was perhaps the most damning thing Daniel said during the entire live stream. The implication that Malaya knew exactly what had happened to Jack and Lily, and that being around Daniel risked exposing that knowledge. Daniel also revealed specific details about what Malaya had taken with her when she fled. According to him, she had only asked for birth certificates, school photos, and 2 stuffed animals. Everything else was still in her house. To Daniel, this detail was significant because it suggested that Malaya wasn't just running with Meadow. She was preparing to take all 3 children, and she was preparing to do it permanently. The implications of this revelation were staggering. If Daniel was telling the truth, it meant that Malaya had been planning to reunite with Jack and Lily wherever they were hidden. It meant that the children might still be alive, but that they were being kept from their family as part of an elaborate deception. Daniel's frustration with the system also poured out during the live stream. He said he had voluntarily taken drug tests and had passed a polygraph exam. He claimed the polygraph had focused on questions about death and that everyone involved had passed. But despite this, he said authorities had remained quiet, offering no clarity and ignoring his attempts to reach out. The timing of Daniel's live stream appearance wasn't coincidental. He felt out of options, unheard, and most importantly, afraid that he would lose Meadow forever. His appearance wasn't calculated or strategic. It was impulsive, emotional, and raw. It was the kind of outburst that comes from someone who believes they have nothing left to lose. Daniel's decision to speak out on a live stream rather than through legal channels revealed his desperation. He had likely already reached out to authorities and either hadn't received a response or didn't believe action was being taken quickly enough. Speaking out publicly wasn't just about venting. It was about making his concerns viral, forcing public attention on a situation he believed was spiraling out of control. But perhaps the most significant aspect of Daniel's live stream appearance was what it revealed about the power dynamics in this case. For months, Daniel had been portrayed as the suspicious boyfriend, the man who might have harmed the children or helped cover up their disappearance. But his desperate revelations painted a very different picture, one where he was not the perpetrator, but potentially another victim of a larger conspiracy. The live stream marked a turning point in the case. For the first time, Daniel had stepped out of the shadows and pointed clearly and unapologetically at Malaya, not as a victim, but as a threat. Whether what he said was true or not, the effect was undeniable. The story had changed, and Daniel had made sure no one would look at Malaya the same way again. But this was just the beginning. The live stream would prove to be the first crack in a wall of deception that had been carefully constructed over months. And as that wall began to crumble, it would reveal not just the lies that had been told, but the terrible truth about what really happened to Jack and Lily Sullivan. The question now wasn't just about finding the children. It was about understanding how many people had been involved in hiding them, how long the deception had been planned, and whether it was too late to bring Jack and Lily home. The live stream was just the beginning. What came next would provide even more shocking revelations about Daniel's knowledge of the case and his role in covering up the truth. In a series of leaked messages that appeared in a public group focused on searching for Jack and Lily, Daniel finally began to reveal what he really knew. These messages didn't surface through hacking or secret leaks. They appeared openly in the comment section of a group likely titled something like "Bring Lily and Jack Home." It wasn't a private forum or encrypted communication. It was out in the open, where anyone could see, respond, and crucially, screenshot. The timing of these messages was significant. They appeared in late June 2025, nearly 2 months after Jack and Lily had disappeared. By then, frustration with the investigation had reached a boiling point. There had been no meaningful updates, no arrests, no official progress. For many following the case, it felt like the investigation was stalling, and people were tired of waiting for answers. But what made these messages so compelling wasn't just their timing, it was their content. For the first time since the children's disappearance, Daniel was speaking with a level of candor and detail that he had never shown before. The careful control he had maintained for months was gone, replaced by raw honesty about what he knew and what he had done. The messages revealed a man caught in the grip of internal conflict. Daniel's words showed someone who was simultaneously trying to protect the woman he loved while grappling with the knowledge that she might be responsible for something terrible. The psychological torment was evident in every message he sent. In one particularly revealing exchange, Daniel admitted that he had been torn from the very beginning. He confessed that he knew more than he had been letting on, but that his loyalty to Malaya had prevented him from speaking out. The weight of this knowledge, he said, had been eating away at him for months. The most damning revelation came when Daniel admitted that he had deliberately misled the search efforts. He confirmed what many had suspected, that he knew the children had not gone into the woods, but that he had allowed search parties to waste countless hours looking in the wrong place. His justification was heartbreaking in its simplicity. He was trying to protect Malaya.